today. And the question we are discussing here is, will young people have the Europe they hope for? And for this, I'm delighted we're going to have with us Herman Van Rompuy, of course, President of the European Policy Centre and President Emeritus of the European Council, a man of vast experience, and he's going to be in conversation with some younger analysts from the EPC. I'm delighted to welcome Danielle, Brady, Programme Assistant, Frederico, Mollet, Policy Analyst working in economic policy, EMU governments, capital markets union, industrial strategy, international trade relations, lots of key areas there. Frederico, great to have you with us. And Sophie Pornschlegel, who is project leader for the Connecting Europe project and a senior policy analyst. She focuses on European integration, German and French EU policy, Franco-German relations and EU party politics. It is great to have you all with us. And Mr. President, thank you so much for being with us. With your permission, I'm going to turn first to the analyst, because linking this to the title of the session, will young people have the Europe they hope for? Sophie, I'm not going to ask you to speak for young people. I'm going to ask you to speak for you, Sophie. And I want to know, what is the Europe that you hope for, and what issues you think we need to focus on if we are to get that Europe that you want? Same question to the three of you. I'll go from Sophie to Frederico and then to Danielle.
Yes,
please, Sophie. Thanks,
Jackie, and I'm happy to be here. And I think what I'm going to say is probably not something that represents young people's view, but rather has been already mentioned, for instance, by Clément Beaune earlier. I think the first one is that I would hope for an EU that thinks strategically rather than just reacting to crisis, whether it comes to digital, climate or the economy, and moving away from more negative integration to really positive integration. My second point is that I wish for Europe that is more ambitious. The Commission is quite ambitious, but that leads me also to my third point. There's a delivery gap. And I think there's an issue that we need a Europe that really delivers, and that requires also member states to really throw their political weight behind what the Commission is proposing and using all the tools at its hands, whether it's on rule of law or climate. And I think there we can see this is not always the case. And this also leads to incoherences that we see within EU policy. Whether it's, for instance, on climate change, when you look at the common agricultural policy, that's not really coherent in what if we want to achieve climate neutrality, but also discussions around green taxonomy, where you now see that we're discussing whether nuclear should be part of a green taxonomy or even gas. So I think these are not really forward-looking debates, and maybe that is also something that we would need to focus on.
And in terms of that delivery gap, Sophie, what do you think lies at the heart of it? What is the problem? Is it, we talked earlier about having capabilities, or does the EU have the capacity to meet expectations? Does it raise expectations by setting targets that it doesn't have the levers to deliver? Is it political will? What is it? Where is that gap?
Yes, I would completely agree with Clément Beaune, and I think it is political will. We know, and we have Mr. Van Rompuy here, who has the experience of the European Council, but I think it really is down to member states making proposals and putting their weight behind it, not only in times of crisis. And I think that was the point also. I wish that we could see, for instance, France and Germany making proposals that are more long-term and more sustainable, rather than only deciding that in a crisis situation we need to move forward, which is good. And I'm not saying that is bad. I mean, I think that the Next Generation EU package was a huge step, but it's something that should be, more sustainable and more long-term. And I think it is down to political will, because of course the institutions, you could always make them better, but I think that this mostly requires politicians to take the decision.
Thank you very much. Frederico, what is the Europe that you hope for? And what does that mean in terms of where the EU's focus should be?
Thanks, Jackie. My sense is very much in line with what Clément Beaune was saying, is that we need a Europe that has a much greater shared sense of common destiny and common purpose, and much greater alignment between all the various parts of the polity as to what its shared interests actually are. And I think to achieve that, we really need to develop a European public sphere. It's not just a matter of policy making, technocratic elites having a consensus for an alignment of vision. I think it has to be a lot broader than that. If I think about, say, the national debates in the two countries that I'm most familiar with, France and Portugal, they are often discussing the same civic and democratic problems, which have a strong European dimension, but the debates are entirely inward looking. entirely fragmented according to national lines. Or if there's any occasion where they look outside, they don't look to other bits of Europe, which have shared history, shared legacies, and the same shared issues. They often look across the pond to the US as the kind of global hegemon and source of discourse power. So I think we need to develop a public sphere that is much more pan-European. And it's not a question of, say, linking Lisbon to Brussels, but rather Lisbon and Paris and Madrid and Oslo, and so that we start to have these conversations in a much more common way.
How do we do that? Is this an issue of new structures, or what sort of thing do you think we need to do?
No, in a way, it's very problematic because it's not something the EU on an institutional basis can actually affect a huge amount of change about. This isn't a question of qualified majority voting or anything like that. It's an organic project that has to come from a strata of civic society across Europe to start to engage much more closely with its neighbors across borders and start developing a shared national framework and language and definition of problems across a whole range of issues that they have in common, whether it's post-colonial legacies or questions of the rule of law, corruption, LGBT rights. We are all having these discussions within national lines, but we need to move them away from that. And you can't expect everyday citizens to really tune into the news in Paris to find out what's going on. But there's a certain section of I think the European opinion formers and civic society that needs to start interacting with each other a lot more. And actually, just quickly to add on Sophie's point on the delivery, because I think that is critical as well. There's another aspect to the delivery challenge that I think is also critical, which is that the EU also needs to develop its operational capacity to a greater extent to be able to deliver, because for a long time the EU has basically been a legislator, and there's been a division of power between the EU level and the member states, and any kind of administrative operational capacity was left to the member states. Now we see that's changing, and we're seeing more responsibility being given to the EU level, but without the accompanying bureaucratic structures that are necessary to deliver it. For example, vaccine procurement was one where it had to be improvised extremely quickly. We're starting to see it develop in areas like border control with Frontex. I suspect we'll start to see it more in other areas of civil defense, which become more and more important. But this is a step change in the kinds of things the EU is being asked to deliver for citizens on the ground. And that requires a very different change to mentality from the usual kind of haute fonctionnaire mentality at the heart of
And very interesting, Frederico, because we've been talking all afternoon about whether the EU has the tools it needs. You're very much focusing on that nuts and bolts operational capacity to deliver on what we've got already. Come back on all of that later. Danielle, complete the picture for us in terms of what is the Europe you hope for?
Well, for me, the Europe I hope for is a Europe a Europe of values, essentially. And I'm not saying that Europe is void of values at all, but that the values that are already there and that the European project is built upon and that are enshrined in our treaties, that they're actually fully realised in all quarters of the EU. And that regardless of, your age or your gender or your sexual orientation or where you come from or what part of the EU you live in, that these values are not called into question or indeed threatened. And for me, this essentially means a Europe of equality. Equality is a core value of the Union, and I hope for a union where we have gender equality, social equality, economic equality, and equality of opportunity. So for this, I think we need a Europe with a strong social dimension, that's ready to face the challenges of the recovery and the transitions, so that we have fair transitions and that we leave no one behind in both the green and digital transitions. And while I understand this perhaps sounds somewhat idealistic, I'm not alone, I don't think, in these hopes. A recent Eurobarometer study actually showed that 9 in 10 Europeans consider a social Europe to be important to them personally. And equal opportunities in the labour market, fair working conditions and quality healthcare were top of their concerns. So yes, this is a Europe I hope for and would ideally like to have, but it's also concerns of EU citizens, and therefore I think that makes it very important.
Thank you very much indeed. Do you think, the degree to which we have a Europe of equality now, Danielle? For example, I'm also thinking, you mentioned age, you mentioned gender and so on. I'm also thinking intergenerationally. Do we have, is our approach to issues, are we delivering intergenerational justice? And if we're not, what is a Europe that really is a Europe of equalities look like? Because we've seen inequalities widen indeed during the pandemic. So we seem to be headed in the wrong direction.
Yeah, unfortunately, the pandemic has really placed a spotlight on the inequalities and gaps in our societies, from how we care for our citizens, particularly the vulnerable. And it's also kind of placed a spotlight on the fragility of employment of many citizens as well. So I think much has to be done in order to promote equality. And I think social inclusiveness is so important, particularly with regard to the recovery. And I think one of the starting point for that, of what needs to be done, is we need to look at implementing and making sure that the pillar of social rights is delivered, and that we meet those targets that have been set out in the action plan, of increasing the number of people in employment, of increasing the number of people undertaking learning, and also to reduce those number of people at risk of poverty and social inclusion. So I think in order to begin to address those inequalities that have become so prevalent and so obvious as a result of the pandemic. They didn't just appear because of the pandemic, but a spotlight has been put on them. And I think that is the starting point, and the starting point is with the pillar. And member states really need to be encouraged to implement policies that will work towards reaching those targets.
Thank you very much. Lots to come back to. Herman, Mr. President, if I could break this down a little bit rather than reacting to all those elements in one, and just that overarching point that Sophie made at the beginning when she said, I want a Europe that thinks strategically, that doesn't just go from crisis to crisis reacting. She wants to turn from the negative to the positive. And you do hear, and it was a question I asked the French minister earlier about, can the EU get out of reactive mode? We have been in a series of immensely challenging crises, but do you see a way of turning the dial now to be thinking more strategically, thinking more in an anticipatory way? How do you see that challenge? You're muted at the moment, sir.
You can hear me now?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm, I think, a little bit pushed in the role of defending what is already achieved. Yeah, but that's not a problem for me. But I want to stress that thinking strategically. Yes, I took office the 1st of December 2009. And then people told me, whispered in my ear, could be that Greece financially will collapse. Could you have anticipated this? Good luck. Then we had the biggest migration of inflow of people coming from the Middle East in centuries. Could you have foreseen this? Good luck. Then we had terrorism. Then we had this pandemic. I hope that is only once in a lifetime. Could you have foreseen this? No. So you have to be to think strategically and to act strategically, but you have to also to acknowledge that we are living in an extraordinary period. I give you a recent example. We thought not that the corona crisis is over, but that we are going back to normality. And all of a sudden we discover that we are now with a spectacular rise of energy prices compared to the quadrupling of oil prices in 1973 when I started my professional life. It was not anticipated by nobody. I'm an economist by formation, and the economists say this is temporary. But nobody had predicted what is happening today. So I would only give you some kind of warning shot. That is, yes, you have to think strategically, but be aware that we are living in a very special time.
But can we do both together? Can we, as you say, we have to react to the crises. They come up, some are not anticipatable.
Precisely.
But can we do both?
Yeah, precisely. What is the biggest issue for our time, That is the climate catastrophe that is already developing now, and that will only get worse in the upcoming decades. So it's a matter of survival, not for Europe. This is a matter of survival for the human race. What happened last year? That the 27 countries, first under the leadership of the German Chancellor and the French President, said, look, we have to agree on an economic recovery post-pandemic. What are the lines on which we are thinking? And they said, what is the future? The future is the digital transition and the ecological transition. So this recovery package is not a traditional recovery package of building roads, building harbors, infrastructure, and so on. No, this is focused on the digital, and it is focused on what is needed for climate change. That is a good example of strategic thinking and acting. It took some time before we could agree, not so much. The French launched and the German launched the idea, I think in May, and we already agreed 21st of July. Of course, we have to implement this. That's true. But the implementation is underway. I'll give you another example. Just before that I took office, a few years, I was, I think at that time also Prime Minister, we agreed on greenhouse gas emissions minus 20% in 2020 compared to 1990. It was very ambitious at that time. What was the result? We did better than anticipated, minus 23. Now we are extremely ambitious. And I think it was Sophie who mentioned the word more ambitious. We are saying now we will do minus 55 in 2030. 2030, that is not centuries. That's just in 8 or 9 years' time. So we are extremely ambitious in the most important issue of our time, of your generation, and even of my generation. So what I draw attention is on what is already achieved and what is underway. Can we do better? Can we anticipate better? Yes, yes. But we are not so bad than the impression that is given.
I'm going to give, if you want to react, wave at me, I'll bring you in. And if you have any more questions, don't let me just ask all the questions. Sophie, you want to come back in?
Yes, I obviously had to respond to that. And I think we do not disagree fundamentally, because I think it's a question of perspective. And of course, looking at the political reality, I think, for instance, saying that we will be climate neutral in 2050 is extremely ambitious. The problem is that with the climate crisis is that we're on a time constraint that I don't think existed before in any other policy fields. So procrastinating, as was mentioned by Clément Beaune, I think is deadly in that case. And that basically brings in a new dimension to what decision makers have to deal with in the European Council. And I think there you could say, yes, it's ambitious, but the question is, and maybe I'm too pessimistic, but I would say that it will be difficult to achieve that aim that we set ourselves if we don't fundamentally change our economy, if we don't decide to invest as now has been done with the recovery plan. But we see that lots of countries still want to discuss, and amongst other France, and I'm half French, and I can say I'm not sure I agree with this, to, for instance, try to put in nuclear in the green taxonomy. So I know that there are also national interests in the short term that are in the way of reaching the more long-term goals that we try to achieve at European level. And the second thing is that the EU has to deal with the fact that, of course, there are 27 different national interests, and they don't necessarily always align with the European interests. And I think that's also in the way of making sure that we achieve what the ambitions that we set ourselves and that have been set rightly so. And I would say that would be, that are quite nice.
Thank you. I want to come back on the delivery question because it links all your questions together. So let us turn, if we might, Frederico, you wanted to come in on that point?
I just had a very quick response to the point that we have had a series of crises that have been rather unforeseeable, would have been very difficult to foresee. And I'm totally in agreement. I think we kind of live in what we call an era of polycrisis. We're not sure what the next one will be, but we know there will be one. But that's when it becomes very important to build in spare capacity and resilience and the ability to act, for it to exist already in preparation for crises that we know are coming. Because I worry that we're seeing a pattern where a crisis comes, everyone turns to the EU, some temporary powers and capacity is given at an EU level to try and tackle the crisis, whether it's shared purchasing of vaccines and distribution, whether it's now with the energy crisis, suddenly there's a push to have sort of centralized bargaining at a European level. But then the moment the immediate crisis fades away, then member states start to try and take away some of those capacities and powers which are necessary for the next one. So it would be unfortunate if we got into a repetitive habit of jerry-rigging capacity at the European level to address an immediate crisis, only to start pulling it back down again the moment the immediate crisis ebbs, when we know that there are others on the horizon. And I think it's more about building permanent capacity and resilience that will be there and can act forcefully whatever the next one is.
Absolutely. I want to come back on the public sphere question, because again, it's a sort of linking horizontal question, but to Danielle's points about she wants, and we talked about this in our session with Clément Beaune, we talked about it in our session with the President of Slovenia, the Europe of values. And she talked broadly. She said, I want that to be fully realized, what is in the treaty, and a Europe of equality, and very concerned that we are moving away from that. Emphasis on social inclusiveness. Herman, in terms of what the EU is doing in this area, how do you see the challenge ahead to ensure that we really do? We talk about a Europe of values, we talk about a Europe of equality. How do we deliver?
Yeah. The Europe of values, mostly it is focused on what's happening in some of our member states in the debate of today. And there the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the European Council even took initiatives, even also unprecedented initiatives to bring those countries again to the European democratic values. It will take some time. But there is a strong reaction from all the institutions and of almost all the member states outside the two that I mentioned. So there is a reaction. There's even a very strong reaction. On equality and solidarity, there again, I have to say or to mention what is already done and what is underway. I will first say, most of the social corrections in our societies are made by member states. Don't forget that each of our member states have very elaborate social security systems. The European Union has a budget that is as big as 1% of GDP. Our member states, public expenditure of the member states are as big as 50% of GDP. So they have the instruments to make the necessary corrections. And in a lot of countries, it is happening. Of course, inequalities are rising, not only due to the Corona crisis, but ahead of the Corona crisis, it was also a result of market forces, of the rise of capitalism, so that the inequalities were on the rise, not as much as in the United States or in the UK or in China, but they are on the rise. As far as the competences of the Union is concerned, don't forget that via the structural funds, a lot of regions, a lot of countries receive via grants each year 2 to 4% of GDP as a transfer. So we are helping those regions who are below the European average. The new Recovery and Resilience Fund is helping those countries most hit by the pandemic. And this is about a fund of as big as 3% of European GDP. The immediate result is that the European budget is doubled for the upcoming 3 years. And I guess this work will continue after those 3 years. So what my only point is, of course, you have to raise this problem of solidarity, because without solidarity, there is no stable society inside each of our member states, and there is no European Union. The European Union is built on solidarity. But the last year, on 2 occasions, we showed that we are engaged in that kind of effort that that is already made by the beginning, by the foundation of the European Union. Again, is it enough? No. But I draw the attention on what already is done at the level of the member states and at the level of the European Union. But you're absolutely right. The battle for values in the broad sense of the word, on equality, on solidarity, on democratic values, is an ongoing battle, But we are all engaged in that kind of effort.
Danielle, can I come back to you on that? Because you work a lot on social policies. You mentioned the pillar of social rights. You seem to set quite a lot of store by that. But this point about most of the levers for addressing the issues you're talking about in relation to equality are at member state level. Do you want to see the EU? I mean, we have a conference on the future of Europe talking about what the EU should do. It may come to a competences debate. It may not. We will see where it goes. But do you want the EU to have more tools, more competences in health, in social, or do you think we can just do more with what we've got, the pillar of social rights, the health union package and so on?
I think we can definitely do more with what we have, and I think in the last year, I think we've proven that. In the last 2 years, perhaps at this stage, but we've had more action I think we could have ever foreseen before this, in terms of the reaction, not the initial reaction, but the subsequent reaction to the pandemic, with the European Health Union, with the European Beaten Cancer Action Plan, all of these initiatives that within the current framework we have been able to put forward. When I say we, the Commission has been able to put forward. So I think for now we need to look at what we can do under the current frameworks, and even the monitoring of progress is important and should not be undervalued either. And pointing out to member states who are not performing well should also not be disregarded. So that can stir action at national level. And I think we can talk for a long time about competencies and whether or not there should be increased competencies in these areas. But I think first and foremost, we need to look at what we can do under the current framework with what we have, because at the moment that's the reality. And I think that should be the key thing at the moment.
A quick follow-up, and I know that Frederico and Sophie want to come in, but I just want to ask you, Herman said, without solidarity, there is no stable society. When we talk about intergenerational justice, what does it mean? Do you feel there is solidarity, Danielle, with your generation? And if there isn't, what does intergenerational justice mean? What would make you feel that it is a reality? Same question to all three of you before we move on, but Danielle first.
I think at the moment, the big issue when I think about generational solidarity is the climate crisis. Because for me, that is, what we're doing now and the policies we're implementing and the transitions we're undergoing may not affect all of us here, but they will affect future generations, perhaps some of the younger generations now. And I think whether we have it or not, and whether it's strong enough, I would question. I think that sometimes it's quite difficult to communicate that to people and to citizens as well. Sometimes that people need to make sacrifices now, and these policies perhaps will be somewhat hard. And I think this is the importance of having a social dimension in these transitions, is that we need to bring people with us across all generations, because if the public and citizens are not behind this, then I would argue that it won't work. And those who will suffer are perhaps my generation and those who will come after me. So I think we need stronger intergenerational solidarity. And I think in order for us to address what Herman described as a climate catastrophe, we will need that. And without it, I don't think it's achievable.
Thank you so much. Frederico.
Just on your question of intergenerational inequality, agree completely with what Danielle has said. Climate crisis first and foremost above literally everything else. I mean, there's other things which I care about intergenerationally, like housing policy, but I think that they're quite firmly in the realm of member state policy. But I actually had a question for Herman, because we're talking increasingly about things that the EU can, should, or maybe it doesn't have the competency to deliver to citizens when we talk about Bill of Social Rights and so forth. But I mean, more generally, do you think that there are other areas where the EU should be delivering more directly to citizens, or are these questions that are really not for the EU? It's really something for the member states or even the individual regions in states where these issues are decentralized, and that the EU should stick to addressing sort of more high-level geostrategic legislative issues that citizens don't feel directly themselves on the ground, or there are actually areas where the EU can make a more direct difference on the ground and should be acting.
Thank you. Herman, come in, and then Sophie, I'll come back to you, I promise. Herman.
Yeah, of course, the immediate issues now are health and climate change. And we can do a lot, even at a European level, even without changing the treaties and changing the repartition of the competences between the member states and Europe. I give you the example of the joint procurement on vaccines. It is not written in the treaties, but if the member states agree to do so, they can do it. They just can do it. So we can do a lot, what we call also on an intergovernmental basis. If we agree on some initiatives, let's do it. And also in health, of course, the social security, that's really a national competence, and health is at the heart of social security. But there are a lot of initiatives that we can take, and I mentioned vaccines, but we can also have cross-border initiatives that can be very helpful, on which we can agree. And for me, it was very striking in the beginning of the Corona crisis, when we saw all those different measures in the member states, when we couldn't travel. And I live in a small country, 50 kilometers, and you are in the Netherlands, 100 kilometers, and you are in Germany, 100 kilometers, and you are in France. So for us, cross-border is something very essential. And people were asking me, where is Europe? They were asking for more Europe, more coordination. And in some way, we give an answer by this Corona certificate with which you can travel all over Europe, so that the Schengen area of free travel and visa-free and passport-free is in some way restored. But the main thing is that there was a strong push from the bottom up to have more European cooperation. And that's a happy thing. During years, we heard that the citizens are Eurosceptic or discouraged, and so on. And in the Corona crisis, we discovered that Europe is much more popular, so to speak, than most people think. But for me, the big issues are, of course, health, but the biggest issue of all is climate change. And there again, we have European tools. We have a lot of national competencies, and in the member states, you have regional competencies, even local competencies. So they have all to work in the same direction to reach that goal in 2030 of minus 55%. Just one word to Sophie about more ambition. Again, when I was in office as president of the European Council, we agreed the targets for 2030 should be minus 40%. We thought it was extremely ambitious. In 2020, the target was minus 20%. Now, the 27 member states agreed on minus 55%. So when you speak about ambition, that is really ambitious. Sophie said, yeah, but there are hesitations, the member states, there is discussion. There will always be discussions, also inside our member states. And don't be misled. Every political discussion doesn't mean that there is a divide, because what only counts is the result on which we agree. The process to an agreement, that takes some time. So don't be discouraged because that country said that and that country said that, and there are hesitation. There comes always a moment of decision. That moment came, for instance, on the recovery fund with this important chapter on climate change funding. That moment came the 21st of July 2020, after 4 nights and 4 days of discussion. Who is remembering those 4 days and 4 nights? Nobody. What counts is the result. Forget the discussion. Look at the results.
Come back on that, because yes, in a crisis that may be the case, but we seem to lack the political will, this point that was made earlier, for delivery on those longer term issues. But Sophie, you wanted to come back in, and then we're going to move to the public sphere question.
Yes, and I do remember those 4 days last summer, because you heard the helicopters, and I was, and I do see how amazing it is that every time 27 heads of states and governments find a compromise, which is unique in the world, I think. But that's not the question. I think the time constraint, once again, I'm too worried that it will be too little too late on the climate crisis. And that's why, going back to what Danielle said on intergenerational justice, we need to, and maybe I'm getting a bit philosophical here, Jackie, but
Good.
I sometimes feel that in politics, you forget what you're doing it for, and it's to make sure that citizens have a good life, and not only citizens now, but also future generations. And I think this is a huge issue, because you do have particular interests coming in. You have majorities at a certain time that might not have the interests of the younger generations at heart. I mean, I'm half German, and in Germany, young people are a minority, so they're really not counting that much in the democratic system, unfortunately. And that's really something, yeah, where I'm a bit more worried. If I can just make a point about the values, because I have to say, and I'm using this also to do a bit of marketing for the EPC events, but there's an event next week on the 3rd of November about the rule of law. I would not say that decision makers had a strong reaction. Maybe the Belgian one, and I think the Belgian Alexander De Croo's speech in the Collège d'Europe was a nice framing of what is happening. But for instance, Merkel's reaction, I think, was not the right one. So I know this is also lots of discussions, but once again, we find ourselves in a situation where I would hope that you do have a political response, and not only leave it to the EU institutions to deal with it. So not only leave it to the European Court of Justice to deal with the issue of rule of law, but really that also the Council actually does not unite against Poland, because that's not the point, but actually defends Europe and defends also Polish democracy against a government that is rather authoritarian.
Thank you, Sophie. Let me come to Frederico's central question. And it links very much to something Clement Beaune said, as you said, Frederico, because Clement Beaune said, you need a sense of belonging. We have to make sure we stand together, because no political project is sustainable without that sense of belonging. And Frederico was asking, how do we develop that shared sense of a common destiny and purpose? And he suggested it isn't really about elites having it, but how do we do that from the bottom up? How do we make that grassroots conversation that works? I'm minded, and I'll come back to you, Frederico, but I want to give Herman a chance to react first. Is something like the Conference of Europe on the Future of Europe at all a vehicle for this? Or you have something, I think, completely different in mind? But whether you see them as complementary or contradictory, I'd be interested to know. But Herman, how do you believe this is important? And if it is, how can that process be supported? But Federico said it's not something actually the EU can do, but is it important? And if it is there anything that politicians generally can do to support that process?
Mm-hmm. The sense of belonging is not only for Europe extremely important, it's also important for our member states. Social cohesion is becoming a problem. The fragmentation of our societies is a problem, not only for the European leaders, but also for the national leaders. And this feeling of togetherness, it is going even beyond just solidarity. And solidarity can be very anonymous, and the social security systems and so on. But effectively, this sense of we are in the same, not only in the same storm, for sure we are, but are we in the same boat? Are we in the same boat? And again, this is a general problem, and it is very specific for Europe, but it is a general problem for our societies as a whole. And that needs a broad range of actions to restore in some way the belief, the faith in the democratic process also. You know that we have all democratic systems, but even those are not challenged by violations of the rule of law and others, even in the so-called traditional democracies, not put under pressure or not under pressure. We have this feeling that, there is this feeling that people have not sufficient, they're not sufficiently involved in the decision-making process. Yes, they can vote, but there is this feeling of abandonment, of alienation, this feeling of not being sufficiently heard, and therefore, the Conference on the Future of Europe can bring not an answer, but it's the beginning of a process of awareness that democracy is much more than rules, much more than institutions, that we need an input of deliberative democracy, of participatory democracy at all levels of power. The democratic deficit, you know, is not a monopoly of the European Union. You have a democratic deficit at all levels of power. And there we have to really to be aware of it, so that there is a much more involvement of, we call it citizens, but involvement of people, as simple as that.
Yeah.
In a country and in the European Union at large. So this feeling of belonging is important, but it is not disconnected from all the other levels of power. And we have to work on it. And the conference is a good occasion.
Frederico, do you feel, I know you were saying this is much more organic, but nevertheless, do you think the Conference on the Future of Europe has a lot of emphasis on youth and hearing from youth and the voice of youth? I hear it every single day, people talking in that way. Does it have a part to play in this, and can it lead to something more organic outside EU structures, outside the EU dialogue, do you think?
I mean, ideally it would, but I'm somewhat skeptical that it will. And I mean, just on the basis that when I look at the public spheres of places like Portugal, I don't think I've seen the Conference on the Future of Europe mentioned once. So I don't feel that it's really creating that link with the national public spheres that would allow them to develop into a kind of in a more European direction. I think really it will take a longer term, and I mean, not necessarily grassroots project, and it depends on how you define the grassroots, because it will always to some extent be a rather elite project, or it will be a certain strata of civic society that will lead it, but it'll have to be them to do it. And I'm not sure the Conference of Europe, I mean, especially in the current circumstances where the energy has been just completely sucked out of it by the various crises that we've experienced.
I just want to ask Danielle, I know you want to come in, Sophie, but Danielle, are you convinced by the Conference on the Future of Europe? Do you think it is giving young people a genuine voice?
I think it's given some people a voice, but I would just echo what Frederico said. I don't think the wider European public are aware of it, and if that's the case, then I would question how successful it can be. And going back to what Herman was saying in terms of citizens feeling that they're not completely involved in the democratic process, if they're not aware of processes that are ongoing, then how can they feel part of it? So that for me is quite basic perhaps, but I think there needs to be greater awareness for citizens, or it needs to be communicated to citizens that these things are ongoing, and perhaps then there will be a greater sense of belonging or being involved in the process. But if you don't know about the process, you definitely won't feel like you're part of it.
Thank you. Sophie, I know you wanted to react to something that was said earlier, but also on this question of the Conference of the Future of Europe. Are you a fan or are you a cynic?
Well, maybe I'm just getting older and becoming more cynic with age, I don't know. But the tradition was going to be perfect, because on the conference, I think one of the most important points is also that it's linked to the existing decision-making processes. And I'm most worried about this, that you raise expectations of citizens, you bring them together, and then it ends up as a report, but that is not linked to where the decisions are really made. So it's a question also of sharing powers with citizens, and I'm not sure that those in power are necessarily able to do so or willing to do so at this point in time. Nevertheless, I think that deliberative democracy is a great way of trying to get more input legitimacy. But it links back to what I said right at the beginning. It is also about delivery. I think we focus a lot on input legitimacy because we realize that citizens feel alienated, that we lack social cohesion, that they do not participate anymore. But the question is also that maybe the decisions that have been made for citizens were just not the right ones for a certain time, and that now they're not happy with it. So maybe it would also be good to try to actually just deliver the decisions that citizens would want to have. And that means also maybe having less particular interests and more decisions that are for the common interest.
Which brings us back neatly to where I wanted to come to. Thank you so much, Sophie, which is your point about the delivery gap. And it comes up in everything. And we seem to have two strands to that delivery gap. One, Frederico mentioned operational capacity. And two, this question of political will. And you said earlier, Herman, people are asking for more Europe, more coordination. So that makes me ask, well, if that's the case, why aren't politicians responding to what people are asking for? Mm-hmm. How do you see this delivery gap? And to what extent do you think it's capacity? And to what extent do you think it's political will?
First one to say this, I should not be the only one. I'm the oldest of this group that is a man of hope. I see that the older generation is expressing hope, and the younger generation is expressing skepticism and even cynicism. I'm quoting. So I try always not to look at the bright side of things, but always to see what the truth is. The truth is always a mix of shadow, darkness, and light, and to give hope also to people, to mobilize them, to make them enthusiastic, to engage them. You shouldn't only stress what's going wrong. You always have to also to remind on what's going well, and that gives people, young and old, the occasion to engage much more than simply demobilizing them. That is my first point. My second is, of course, the conference on the future of Europe. I will not discuss this. That will only be one of the many stepping stones. But there can be interesting ideas to implement in a further stage. The conference itself, I have not too much expectations that this will be the game changer. But the product, the output of the conference, that can be interesting, provided that we achieve a consensus. It is not along the traditional lines of decision-making in the European Union, because those panels with citizens and the digital consultation is completely new. They never used that kind of tool in, for instance, in the convention that was set up 10 years ago and so on. This is, we'll see what the outcomes is, but the process itself, there I fully agree that is not mobilizing a lot of people, but the instruments they can create that can mobilize people much more than that. On the delivery gap, we call it the output gap also. So what the output gap is, what is promised of what is needed, and what is the final result. Again, there is light and there is shadow in all this. The Eurozone crisis, it took us 2.5 years. Actually, we overcame the crisis, we stabilized the situation, and now we are 10 years further, almost, and the euro is there. And I said the euro is there for our children and grandchildren. So we overcome this major crisis. There were a lot of doubts, there was a lot of hesitation, but we overcame it. Even on vaccination, to give a recent example, in the beginning there was hesitation. The European Commission was ridiculed. We were lagging. Look at the UK, look at the US. Yeah, look now. We are doing better than the UK. We are doing better than the US. We're doing better than China, of course, than Russia. And we are the best in the world. We are the best in the world. So there is a delivery gap, but there are also major achievements. And we shouldn't forget that. The delivery gap is also another issue. In the political landscape today, all parties became small parties. And so they try to get a profile. And in order to get a profile, a lot of them make untenable promises. Of course, they cannot keep those promises. And then you have this kind of delivery gap. So this is, unfortunately, part of the democratic process these days. But when you look objectively, and I'm speaking now on Europe, I'm not speaking on what's happening in the member states, there are also successes on major issues. The pandemic is a major issue. Climate change is a major issue. And of course, you can always put the bar so high that nobody can reach it. My only message is this. I am fully aware of it, and when you read my text and listen to what I said, I'm fully aware of the delivery gap, not only at the European level, but also at the level of the member states. And I will repeat it, my message is, look also to what is delivered. And then you can create hope for people. Yes, we can. We can do better, but we also can. And that is something that we badly need in this time of despair. It's sometimes in this time where that people are doubting, and sometimes wrongly, sometimes it's sometimes rightly, where they are doubting about the efficiency of policies and of the
Thank you very much, Herman.
Yeah.
And thank you for giving us a positive note. As you say, we're normally supposed to be, the oldsters are supposed to be the doomsters and gloomsters. Just I wanted to read a comment. It's a question, but it's also a comment from EPC policy analyst Laura Rayner, who says, does it matter that citizens are not involved in the political processes? If member states and the EU delivered better outcomes for citizens, equality of opportunity, social mobility, support through the transitions, levels of political trust, she suggests, would improve regardless. I just leave that there on the table. Sophie, I know you want to come back in, but we don't have long, and I want to put two questions to each of you and then give Herman a chance to react. And it really relates, first of them is to the political will question. Because two things about modern EU leaders, they don't stand up, and I know this is a passion of yours, they don't stand up and defend the EU to their populations, and they don't, as we've said, they are not showing the political will at the moment to move forward. And I like your comment about in politics, often forget why they're doing it. If each of you, this is really mean, but I'm going to put you all on the spot. Firstly, if you had to say one thing to convince today's EU leaders that it is in their political interest and in their country's interest to make the case to defend Europe and show the political will to find solutions, what's the one thing you would say, your elevator pitch, if you like? And secondly, if you were them for a day, if you were what Herman was, a head of state or government, and you were only in that job for one day and could only do one thing to deliver the Europe you hope for, at least set us on the right track, what would it be? I don't mind who goes first. I'm going to go to Frederico first this time. Frederico, so what would you say to convince a politician to show that political will? And what would you do if you were in charge for a day?
I mean, I'm not sure there's a magic combination of words. If there was, I'm sure someone would have used it by now.
What would be the motivation behind it?
But I think because otherwise history would judge them rather harshly if they did not. But I'm not sure how much that motivates some people. On the second one, I think if I had one wish for a day, I think it would definitely be whatever the reform of the fiscal rules ends up being, is that it allows for the surge in green investment that will be absolutely critical to delivering the green transition. I think that would be the main one.
Thank you very much. Danielle, your message to politicians and your priority when you're in charge.
I think I would just refer to the fact that we have some evidence of what can happen and the impact that it can have when delivery is not communicated properly, and when a member state or a government perhaps fails to really showcase the benefits of EU membership. I'm referring to the UK here, and I think communication obviously played a massive role in the whole Brexit referendum before, after, and I think I would just perhaps allude to that and let them to put the pieces together themselves after that. And in terms of if I had the honour of sitting in the hot seat for a day, I think I would look at perhaps realigning the EU's economic governance framework and putting sustainability and well-being really at the centre of it. I think it would support what's needed in terms of the transitions, increase EU resilience, and really reboot the social contract, which I think perhaps is buckled under the weight of demographic and technological change.
Thank you very much. Sophie, you're in charge for a day. What are you going to do? And what are you going to say to politicians to convince them to make the case for Europe and to show political will?
I'll start with the second one. I would simply make an elevator pitch explaining that you should use the EU in your own interest, and you can use it as Macron did to win elections. So the very realpolitik way of doing it. And you can align your national interest with the European interest, and then you win even more out of it. So that would be my pitch. If I would be in the seat, I would do a few things. I think I would try to organize a long brainstorming between the French and the German head of states, actually thinking strategically about what they could do for the EU. I don't think there's enough time for thinking in politics as I experienced it. So I think it would be good at that highest level. They sit together. I'm sure they do, but really to think more long term. I would probably brief ministers and say that they cannot scapegoat the EU and use it for their own interests. That's not okay. And then I would also try to just reach out to heads of states and governments to make sure that policy files like climate and digital go forward, and make sure that, throwing your political weight behind the Commission is really what should be done.
Thank you very much, Herman. I'm tempted to say, if you were still in the hot seat, what would you do? But you can take up that challenge or not. But really, on this question of political will, and what all three of them have said about what they would say to today's EU leaders about defending the EU to their populations and showing the will to find solutions to the challenges. A thought from you, a final thought on what they've said and how you see the way forward.
We often underestimate public opinion. And we have seen that also regarding Europe. You know that the trust in Europe has raised by 10 points since the British referendum in 2016. So the rest of Europe is convinced that there is no good life on the European continent without the European Union. And this is something that comes bottom up. So the confidence in Europe is on the rise instead of declining, and especially since Brexit. And so politicians often underestimate public opinion. And I'll give you an example in the Corona crisis. Most of the politicians in my country and other countries are promising freedom. You will get your freedom back once that you are vaccinated, and once let's say the worst point of the Corona crisis is behind us. And they are promising all the time freedom, whilst public opinion is much more cautious. They are more thinking in terms of responsibility for those with whom they live and for the society at large. And they are much more interested in responsibility than in freedom. They are much more cautious than their leaders. So my argument is to my former colleagues, and in Belgium it's not a problem, of course, but to leaders of other countries, be more European, because it could be that it even is electorally not detrimental. On the contrary, and the example of Macron was a very good example. I remember that when he was elected in 2017, I think, he came in Paris on the Champs-Élysées on the tones of the the European anthem. That was an absolutely great moment. In the debate with Marine Le Pen, he won that debate brilliantly on one issue, Europe. It's not the case in all the countries, but be much more courageous on Europe. You can even benefit electorally of it. And that's my first point. My second point is, of course, we have a lot of problems facing us, and I have not one specific point that I would put on the agenda, but for me, the general implementation of the Green Deal is the biggest issue for the leaders of today and tomorrow. And all what is helpful for that, and a suggestion was made by, I think by Frederico, all what is helpful for that is most welcome, but that is the big issue.
Thank you.
The second point is not so much related to what citizens are asking directly, but is in a longer term perspective, it's absolutely necessary. That is this idea of European sovereignty and strategic autonomy. If we want to play a role in the world, if we want to defend our interests, to promote our values, we shouldn't be strategically too dependent on others in so many areas. You cannot play a geopolitical role, again, in the name of your interest, in the name of your values, when you are completely dependent on the digital, on migration, on technology, on so many other issues, on energy. We discovered that in the recent days. So if your hands are tied, you cannot be a leader, or you cannot play the role we should play.
Thank you.
And of course, there's a long-term perspective, and ask the citizens that they will not give you that as a priority. But in a few years and a few decades, we see that we can be marginalized in the world and not defending anymore our interests and our values. Then we'll discover that we missed the train of European sovereignty.
Thank you so much, Herman, and brilliantly tying together all the strands of our discussion throughout the afternoon. Thank you very much to Danielle, to Sophie, to Frederico for a great conversation. I wish we had another hour. So many fascinating topics to explore together. Really grateful. And as always, Herman, thank you not only for taking part in this debate, but also for all the work you do for the EPC. Thank you. That was wonderful. A privilege to moderate. Very grateful to you. But we are not finished yet, ladies and gentlemen. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Yanis Emanuelidis, the EPC's Director of Studies, to talk about transitions and delivery, his key takeaways from today's discussions. I don't envy you, Yanis. I think it's almost impossible to do this in a short way, but over to you for some final thoughts.
Thank you, Jackie. And I will try to do my best. And I will share, I think, three main takeaways out of the discussions we've had at this year's annual conference. And the first one is that when looking at the COVID-19 crisis, there was a general agreement that the EU dealt with this crisis better than it dealt with previous crises. And that there's a need to take a lesson from that. In the words of Clément Bon, we need to keep up the sense of urgency. So what he was telling us during crisis, in this crisis, we reacted rather positively, but we need to keep up that sense of urgency even when we are not under the impression and the pressure of concrete crisis, because we can, if we want to deliver, if there is the political will to do so. But he also reminded us that there's a need for and I'm quoting him here, a narrative of pride, a forward-looking positive narrative we need to dare. So he was saying we do not only have to defend, we do not only have to react, but we also need to be perspective. We need to think of what we should be doing beyond being in a reactive mode. And many people referred to, and you were asking a lot of them, Jackie, about what role the Conference on the Future of Europe could play in this effort. And Danuta Hübner said, this is an opportunity which we should not waste. We should make the best out of it. We should use it as a pressure tool to keep up pressure to change things at the European Union level. But then we heard also a lot of skepticism. My colleague Frederico said he was skeptical. Others were saying people are not aware of the conference. They're not aware that it does exist, that it's happening. And let me add, and this is something which is done on purpose. There are forces who do not want this conference to be something which is taking a lot, absorbing a lot of energy, but also making a difference. And let me just conclude this first takeaway with something with Herman said, Herman van Rompuy, and I think it's important. We are all in the same storm, but something which we still do not understand is that we are also in the same boat. And I think that this is an important note to make. The second takeaway relates to the rule of law. And it's even more than the rule of law, because there was a lot of discussion as to how important the rule of law is. And there was an agreement. It is a core issue. It is a fundamental value. It is the vital basis of the European Union. We cannot do without it. And in the words of my colleague Danielle, we need to defend the Europe of values. And Sophie said we need to defend democracy. So there was a strong plea and a strong also emphasis on the need to defend our values, to be behind them, to make sure that there is pressure to defend the value in those countries by those member states government, I should be precise, who are undermining it. But at the same time, we're also reminded we need an open dialogue. But I want to conclude my second takeaway on the rule of law with a quote from MEP Danuta Hübner. And it was an advice and part of an analysis, I think, which she's having, when she said that we have to wait for Polish voters to help Europe. I think that is a sentence we should have in mind. That doesn't mean that from the outside we not need to act and need also defend the core values of the European Union, but a lot depends on what is happening in Poland itself. And the third and final takeaway relates to the title of this year's annual conference. Is Europe still in the global race? And I would add to that, while major transitions are taking place. I think with respect to the direction of the answer given from many of our panelists, there was a clear direction. People were saying we need to respond to the global shifts. We need to be more ambitious. We need to define, what kind of actor we want to be, is something which Ricardo said. And the president of Slovenia, President Paha, was probably the most ambitious when he said we even need to reform the EU fundamentally. We need another convention. That was something which not many subscribed to, but he was very forceful in saying we need that convention. We need to change the EU more fundamentally. And he was talking about 2030 when he was thinking about that process. And he even said that, with another aspect, he was the most ambitious when he said enlargement is something which should happen as fast as possible, given that it is, in his words, a geopolitical question, a question of our credibility. But many of our guests in the different panels and of my colleagues were also looking at the internal dimension of the European Union and saying that much more needs to be done if Europe wants to be able to deliver, to play a role in this global race. They were speaking about the need for more strategic thinking, the need to be more ambitious, the need to overcome the delivery gap, which we often witness at the European level, the need to have a stronger political will and to enhance the political public sphere in Europe. So there was a clear sense of direction and a lot of what is being requested. But when you listen carefully throughout the entire afternoon, by the way, also this morning when we had a strategic council meeting, there is a feeling of doubt as to whether the European Union will be able to live up to what I would call the poly transition, because we're witnessing many transitions at the same time. The global transition, the digital transition, the democracy transition, where we have to adapt our democracies to the challenges which is facing. And that was highlighted by everyone. Also now in the last session, the green transition, which most of our of those who spoke at this annual conference were saying this is a matter of survival, to quote Herman van Rompuy, a key issue of intergenerational solidarity, as some of my colleagues mentioned in the last session. So there is this emphasis on the need to cope with the major transition, especially with the green one. But there is this question, will we be able as a European Union to cope with the multiple transitions which we're facing? We're living in extraordinary times, unprecedented challenges. Will we be actually able to live up to that? And I felt that there was a lot of question marks whether we will be able to do so, a lot of doubts. Sophie was saying, we're doing too little too late when it comes to climate, to the climate crisis. We're not forceful, we're not ambitious enough when it comes to these crises. So there seem to be doubts as to whether the European Union will be able to deliver on those most significant challenges linked to the major transitions which we're facing. And that at the end of the day will also determine as to whether Europe will be able to still play a role in the global race, whether it will be able to live up to that, what citizens also are asking from Europe to deliver. So there was not only positive attitudes, there were also some doubts, but at the same time, I think we had a lot of constructive discussions. And I want to thank all of those who participated in the annual conference, the panelists, our guest panelists, all of my colleagues, also those who are operating behind the scenes, because all this would not be possible without you. Jackie, for this magnificent moderation since 9 o'clock this morning. I must tell everyone, she has been moderating continuously, so a major effort. And last but certainly not least, a big thanks also to Herman for participating in today's annual conference, but also for the role he's playing as president of the European Policy Center. So this was my attempt. 3 takeaways, Jackie. I'm sure I omitted a lot of things, but I tried my best.
Thank you very much. You did it magnificent, Yannis. And can I just say it's been an absolute privilege to moderate the discussions today, and just add my thanks to all our speakers, to the EPC analysts who contributed front of house, as it were, on stage, and those, as you say, the team behind the scenes who worked so hard to bring it all together. Thank you to all of you for joining our discussion, for your questions, your comments. It really has, as I say, been a very stimulating afternoon, raised more questions perhaps than answers, but that guides the EPC's work going forward. So it's all immensely valuable. Thank you very much and have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye.